Dear ambassadors, dear colleagues, very good afternoon to all of you. I think in the meantime you are all familiar with our Big Ideas series. And in this series we are hosting several ministers, CEOs, thought leaders, experts to share their views with us, with our ambassadors, with our diplomats, with our experts at the IEA. And you may recall that last time we have hosted the Australian Energy Minister, Mr. Frydenberg, who became, after this event, Deputy Prime Minister. So just that you know, Michael, so it brings luck sometimes. And before him, several ministers and CEOs shared their thoughts with us. Now, today we have a distinguished expert, very well established thought leader, a very successful entrepreneur, if I may say so, and a leading consultant on many issues, but especially in the context of renewable energy, new technologies, and innovation. So, who is Michael Liebreich, a colleague that we know each other since a very long time. He is very well known to IEA family. His vision, his thoughts, his comments, we value extremely. And he's, some of you may know, he's extremely active also in the social media and share his views and thoughts. Michael is currently the chairman and the CEO of Liebreich Associates, and he works on a range of issues with this company on the clean energy, transport, infrastructure, technology, climate finance, and sustainable development. But he's also known as the founder of the New Energy Finance in 2004, which became later on Bloomberg New Energy Finance 5 years later. And until recently, he was a board member of the Transport for London. He is founding chairman of Eco Villages, a Swiss charity focusing on sustainability of mountainous regions. He is, in addition to energy, I should say clean energy, technology, and innovation, he is also an Olympic skier. Michael, we also found that. And you participated with the British team to Olympic Games in, where was it? 92, okay. And, but he still skis, I think, next to your wonderful chalet in the Swiss Alps. And he is an excellent speaker, you will see, very entertaining speaker and a highly skilled communicator. And he is somebody who I think we should all get inspiration from, with his thought-provoking vision, views, and others. Now, Michael, we are delighted as the IEA family here and the OECD family to host you here with us for our Big Ideas series. And I would like to ask our colleagues to join me to welcome Michael Liebreich. So, as we always do, I would like to ask Mr. Liebreich to share his vision, his thoughts in a few minutes. Afterwards, we can discuss in a dialogue with the colleagues here, and I will also have one or two issues to raise with you. Can I turn it to you, Michael?
Thank you very much, Fatih, and thank you for the invitation. it has been a long time we've known each other, and I think both of us and the colleagues, all of our thinking has evolved really considerably during that time. But it's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you also to Your Excellencies and the audience. I think let me take that sort of transition over the time that we've known each other as the starting point for a few remarks. So I started New Energy Finance, which is a provider of information. So it's a very odd audience because some of you know all of this, and some of you of the ambassadors perhaps not been following the blow-by-blow of New Energy Finance's activities. But I started back in 2003-04, and this whole idea of an energy transition was fantasy. I mean, there was alternative energy, and the accepted wisdom was that it would remain pretty alternative, maybe sort of less than 1% of the world's energy mix, and it stayed that way for a few years, and it was that way when we first met. I think that was still the view. But if you fast forward to now, clearly we're in a very, very different world. And if you open the newspapers or you watch any business program, it'll be full of stories about renewable energy, about electric vehicles, very extreme stories in some cases about cities banning internal combustion or countries moving off internal combustion, about how solar is cheaper than coal in India, and offshore wind is now competitive without subsidies. And so you could get the impression that this is all game over, and we're all going to go to 100% renewable energy and electric vehicles, and there's no controversy. But you also get this sort of drumbeat of another perspective, which is still there, which is all of this is nonsense. And you get, you'll get at that extreme, you'll get people like Bjorn Lomborg saying, only 0.8% of primary energy is wind and solar, and it's going to grow to less than 2%, and so it's all nonsense and nothing, and a waste of funds and resources. And you'll get very, very smart and very distinguished economist Václav Smil saying, the hope of a rapid transition is all misplaced, and we're not going to get a rapid transition. So where are we, in my view, and based on the data that although I no longer run Bloomberg New Energy Finance, I clearly still work quite closely with them. I use a lot of their information, but I'm also becoming increasingly reliant on the excellent work of many of you in the room and Fatih's team. I talk about it as what I call the 3/3 world, which is where we'll be in 2040, and that will be 1/3 of the electricity will be wind and solar, so variable. 1/3 of the vehicles will be electric, and will be about 1/3 more energy efficient. We'll be a lot more energy productive, but energy efficiency will be about 1/3 better. And that's where that's neither extreme of 100% renewable energy, nor is it the extreme of nothing is happening. Just in terms of the electricity piece, first of all, we are, as those of you who work for the IEA will know, somewhere around 8% of electricity is now wind and solar. So if you compare it to primary energy, it's of course irrelevant. 2/3 of primary energy is thermal waste, and wind and solar compete in the electricity markets, not across all of energy. And that proportion is going up. The grids around the world are accepting it. Some of it's very, very cheap. It can be extremely cheap, sub 2 cents US per kilowatt hour. And there is the enormous amount of focus in the past on grid competitiveness. Renewable energy is now better than grid competitive. 2 cent, 3 cent, 4 cent, 5 cent, 6 cents is cheaper than any other source of electricity. So we've gone beyond the tipping point where some proportion of clean energy makes sense in the electricity mix. But there's another tipping point coming when it actually makes sense to switch off coal or gas or nuclear that's operating. So instead of just saying, well, we're going to, as the electricity demand grows, we'll meet that growing demand from renewables, we will get to the point somewhere around 2030 where it'll actually make sense to start switching stuff off and running renewables instead. And then, of course, the potential market grows and the penetration will grow. And where we're headed to is whenever it's windy, whenever it's sunny, you should be using wind or solar because it's so darn cheap. Of course, it raises the question, what do you do when it's not windy or sunny? But that will be penetration of around a third. I think IEA currently, the new policy scenario, it's 20% by 2040. BNEF, it's 39%. It's sort of irrelevant in the detail because the mental picture is about a third. Profoundly influential because it's zero marginal cost and it's variable. You can't always guarantee it, and therefore you've got to have a portfolio of other technologies to complement it. And a lot of the focus is on, number one, what are those technologies and how do the costs also go down the experience curves, and the policy framework. How do you make sure that it makes sense for an investor to put their money maybe into a gas-fired power station that's only used 6 or 10 weeks a year, or a battery, or large amounts of demand response? How do we actually get that done? There's a number of trends that will help with that around digitization, which is going to be an enormous advantage. None of this can be done without digitizing everything. But another one is electrification of vehicles. And actually, in the history of new energy finance, I started on renewables. Because they're variable, you have to become expert on Internet of Things or smart grid. But then you start thinking about power storage, and immediately you realize the big driver is actually going to be vehicles. And the battery costs have come down 80% in the last 6 years, and they're going to come down another 70% in the next 12 years through till 2030. Just experience curve economics. And that means that there are breakpoints also for vehicles. Right now, if you drive, let's call it 30 or 40 miles a day, so a lot of annual miles, but not many on an individual day, already, without subsidies, you should probably go electric, without subsidies. More and more use cases, the total cost of ownership will flip based on the battery prices coming down. But something very interesting starts happening around 2025, maybe a few years before or after, and that is that the sticker price of the electric vehicle becomes cheaper than the sticker price of internal combustion engine. And then, of course, that opens up the market to not just to people who calculate their levelized cost of transport, their total cost of ownership, but it opens it up to absolutely everybody. And so we see electrification based on the fundamentals, based on the economics, really taking off in the early 20s and through 2025 and through to 2030. So the 1/3 electrification of vehicles. Some of the recent work that I've been doing has been looking at what about not just cars, but what about buses, what about trucks, what about ships, what about trains? And we can talk about that perhaps in the Q&A. The energy efficiency piece, I think actually there are people in the audience who have done lots of detailed work on this. That's not really, getting 1/3 more energy efficient over the next 22 years is not a controversial statement. And we are seeing it whether it's LED lighting, process improvements, building efficiency. We seem to be in a different regime the last 10 years or so where energy prices around the world are high and they're perceived as high and volatile, which means that companies and individuals are investing much more in energy efficiency. And of course, there's also the climate issues which are resonating. So we're going to be in this 3/3 world. I don't think that's, I think as you lay it out, it becomes not even to my mind, not even a controversial statement, and it has profound implications. It's way beyond anything we could have expected back in 2003, 2004, when I set up New Energy Finance, 2005 or 6, when Fatih and I first met. It's far beyond that, and it gives us enormous right to hope from a climate perspective, because we've seen this runaway curve of increasing emissions really be bent downwards. But in no way is that alone sufficient to reach the Paris targets. So if we want to do Paris, we're going to have to go far beyond the 3/3 world, and we have to get into difficult transport sectors, industry, heat, and then, of course, the non-energy sources of forestry, land use, and so on and so on. But I think from what we've seen so far, I remain very optimistic because I look at the world, I look at that progress to the third world, and I see the role of innovation. Fatih, you talked about, most of my work is about innovation, and I see what has been achieved over there. Then I look at heat, and I see the people trying to innovate. I see the technologies. I look at the difficult sectors of transportation or industry, and in a sense, I think all the shocks now, all of the black swans in the energy space, look like black swans to the positive. They look like things that will help us rather than things that will hinder us as we try and really squeeze the carbon out of the system. And so that's kind of my world view after about 14 years of doing this.
Thank you very much, Michael. This is so comprehensive and so thought-provoking and challenging many conventional wisdom views in terms of energy. Yes, Michael and I met several years ago, and having lunches, discussions, I always enjoy and learn from those discussions, and we follow each other's work. And when we did, Michael, you may remember the 2006 World Energy Outlook, we made our first 2 degrees scenario. It was the first ever in the world before anybody did it. And Michael was very supportive of our work at that time. And we have seen many organizations and others with 5 or 6 years delay also followed it. And there's a very good debate now, and we always enjoy Michael's views and comments. Now, I have one question, Michael. You mentioned the power sector and the transport sector, but there are other sectors which we call hard to mitigate. So industry and heat. What are your views on that?
Well, I think it's too early to say, there's this kind of fog of uncertainty in those sectors. But it's not that different from where we were with electricity. If you go back to, 2004, 5, 6, I don't think we could have seen that wind, would be produced at 2 or 3 or 4 cents per kilowatt hour. I mean, even 3, 4 years ago, none of us really could confidently say offshore wind for 5 or 6 cents levelized cost. So we're seeing, we're seeing in some of those sectors that there are the ideas, but it's going to take a few more years before we can see which ones will really be successful and which ones will scale. So it's very, and obviously, in industry it's very different. Aluminium smelting is very different from concrete, cement manufacturing, but there are routes forwards. I think in a lot of those industrial sectors, we're going to have to get into the sort of hydrogen and chemical, different chemical pathways as ways of delivering the intense bursts of heat that are required. It's hard to see that being delivered. If your model, some people have the model, they say, electrify everything and take carbon out of electricity. And I think we can already see that won't work because of these great bursts of heat, of generally heat required in industry, but also heat for heating. I mean, we had this educational experience in the UK this year, the Beast from the East, where the temperatures dropped. We got this, I don't know what it's called technically, but it was cold for about a week. And, the peak heating demand during that week was, I think, 6 times electricity demand, average electricity demand. So if you want to meet that without insulating your homes, and even if you do heat pumps and you do whatever you can and you insulate and so on, we're talking about probably switching on 2 or 3 new grids worth of electricity. I think I saw the figure, I didn't check it, but 150 gigawatts of additional demand that came online within a day or some ridiculous time. So it's not going to be electrical. But, if we come at it chunk by chunk and we have a decadal view, Sweden added 1% of homes to CHP systems every year, so 10% per decade for 60 years. And, taking those sorts of long-term views, some of it will go to super insulation, some of it will go to heat pumps, some of it will go to probably biogas injected into the system. But at some point we're probably going to have the hydrogen conversation for heating as well, or hydrogen or ammonia, one of those conversations.
Thank you very much. One other question afterwards, I will go to our colleagues.
Let me just come in on that, because I think there's one other point I want to make here, which is very often in this discussion, what we see is an impasse in the discussion. The discussion gets roadblocked because we can't solve the last 5%. And you see this around 100% renewables, and you get this other people say, no, we can't have that. We'll never get beyond 85%. Well, who cares? I have 3 small children. They're really, really smart. Let's leave part of the problem for them to solve too, because we can solve so much, and in the solving lies the learning. As we innovate, we learn, and when we learn, we can innovate. And so if we try and design sort of 5-year plans from here to eternity, or 50-year plan to solve everything, we won't make it. We won't start. We'll stay on the starting grid arguing about the last 5 or 10 or 15%. And I think that's one of the things I try to do is let's have some action and have some learning.
3 small children and a great father. I am once again faster than you. I have a grandchild. So this is.
It's a future Secretary General of the IEA.
So now I have one question, and I will go to the floor. And you mentioned the energy transition is happening, but not fast enough. How we can speed up the clean energy transitions?
So I think if I had a kilowatt hour of clean energy for every time I've been asked that question, we would already have completed the transition. I'm sure you feel the same way. But I think what's really interesting, and I've now got this kind of 14-year perspective of tracking it, is it's policy. It's all about innovation. At the end of the day, it's not going to be about sacrifice. It's not going to be about not going on holiday, or not having a warm house, or not doing not eating the foods we want to eat, and so on. And so it's got to be in a sense, it can be a demand and supply side, but it's got to provide the services that we all want. And by the way, when you look at the developing world, it's absolutely, for equity reasons, got to bring people out of energy poverty and give access to them. I think we agree on that. And that means it's got to include a massive amount, I call it sort of distributed massive innovation. Just the energy system has to look completely different, not just bigger, but very different. And innovation is going to be technology innovation. Everything from research and development through to deployment has to be at the heart of any successful sort of system approach. How would you want the system to deliver more solutions? It's got to be around innovation. So those who say we've got to, it's policy driven, then my worry is a lot of policy-driven solutions tend to be very antithetical or very hostile to innovation, because the more policy-driven your economy is, the worse it tends to be. Not always, but it tends to be for the innovators and the people who will do crazy things like start up companies and run with ideas. And so I think the success is going to lie in the interplay between policy solving some of the externalities and removing some of the barriers, and then innovation that will pick up the baton. I think the work of Mariana Mazzucato is very, very interesting in terms of where does technology come from, the entrepreneurial state, although she and I would disagree very strongly on who should pick up the baton when in the process, because entrepreneurs are just brilliant at understanding consumers, whether they're commercial or retail, picking up the baton and getting those implementations, getting that deployment out there is all about private money and private entrepreneurs, but they can't operate in a policy vacuum. So I think we've got to, it's kind of directed, massively distributed innovation is how we'll solve it.
Excellent. So now I will get some questions or comments from the colleagues. You know, some of our colleagues already you discuss with Paolo all the time, with Laszlo and the others in the meetings and so on. So who would like to start to ask first question to Michael?
Easy questions, please, Paolo.
We start with Paolo. Yes, I didn't see Paolo, please.
Michael, you mentioned correctly...
And Laszlo comes in. When you talk about him, he comes in always. So exactly.
About heat and industry, a number of sectors difficult to abate. Can you elaborate maybe a little bit about the role of bioenergy? You didn't speak a lot about bioenergy. Can you elaborate a little bit on that, both now and in the future? Thank you.
So I have the disadvantage of not having done any detailed modeling, unlike you. You probably know the answer to the question. But you know, if you just follow the logical chain that says it can't all go electric, it has to be, you know, it's just the grids, the volume and the peakiness is simply too high, then you end up saying, well, gas is obviously not just a fabulous solution, but it's a solution that we already have, particularly in a country like the UK. We have a lot of the infrastructure already in place. So how do you decarbonize it? Well, you can't decarbonize distributing everybody's home boiler or every small company. You can do a certain amount with CHP, which is, of course, you know, we should do that. The example I gave about Sweden. But you end up with some kind of large residual, which is going to be gas for the next, you know, I'm going to say 30, 40 years. You know, what happens after 40 years, you know, who knows? We could all be using, you know, fusion energy or crazy, whatever. You know, we've got to be very, we've also got to understand that there is a certain time period where we really don't know. It sort of becomes foolish to talk about. But if we talk about that residual of heating, how do we decarbonize it? And that's where I think biomass in heating has to have a role. Biomass or biogas in heating has to have a role. There's also the potential for I see a potential for biomass or biofuels in the difficult sectors of transportation. You know, where I've arrived in my thinking about transportation is anything under about 250 or 300 miles is going to go electric, and that includes aviation, because it's just a feasible route. And as we clamp down, first of all, it'll become, that will happen because of the economics, that the economics of batteries driven by cars and then buses, or in fact buses probably faster than cars, I think we're going to see. That will then work in commercial vehicles, heavier commercial vehicles. It's already starting to work in short distance ferries. It'll roll out across and ultimately into aviation. But then there's the difficult parts of long-distance transport. And if you want to say, oh, well, we should go to hydrogen, I tell you, a drop-in biofuel or a synthetic fuel that might be an expensive solution compared to fossil hydrocarbons, but it's going to be a lot cheaper than building an entire new infrastructure for hydrogen in transportation. So I think I see... I guess the short answer to your question is I see that the biomass, biogas, biofuels very useful for the things we can't do through electrification, and there'll be plenty of those.
Let me tell you, just backstabbing Paolo here, why he asked you this question. Every year we publish our annual renewable report. Which became a very popular publication in the renewable energy circles and beyond. And this year, Paolo and Jaime are focusing on the report, which is coming, Paolo, on 8th of October. And this is focusing an issue which we call blind spots of energy, which is biomass, modern biofuels, bioenergy. And I don't dare to give the numbers before it goes to press, but it is contribution. Bioenergy's contribution to electricity generation, total energy consumption is much higher than other renewables, and I think it is the reason why we highlighted. I'm sure, Laszlo, when you were walking in, you already talked about a question, but before that, while you think about this, I think Laura wants to ask a question. Laura.
Thank you very much, Mr. Liebreich, and very interesting vision for the 3/3 world. A question on a couple of things. So you highlighted the 6% role of solar and wind today in power generation. And of course, in our analysis, we show that actually government had an incredible role to play to get to those levels. So sometimes there may be a narrative out there that romanticizes a bit the role of innovators. So we have spent 400 billion in public money to have very good news of reaching $1 trillion invested in renewables, which is great. Now, if you go back to your vision, one third, we don't get with those levels to a 2D scenario. We would miss it completely. In our analysis, we need to get to something close to 80% of low carbon technologies in the power sector alone by 2040. So what is the message that we need to give to our governments? We had good stories on innovation, but some others not so good. Carbon capture and storage, we are not seeing much of it. What's the key message to speed up the transition?
There's a few statements and even a question or two in there. I'm not sitting here saying that government policy didn't achieve what we've seen, but I do think that some of that has been very inefficiently spent, but also there are time dependencies. So Germany's feed-in tariff was absolutely fabulous at getting stuff built. It was effective. It wasn't efficient, but I think we have to be nuanced enough to be able to say, well, that was fantastic, but that doesn't mean that every country should now follow the same, use the same mechanism, spend the same amount, etc., etc. So yes, there is. I talked about Mariana Mazzucato and the entrepreneurial state, and I don't think the role of government is just research in the lab and then throw things over the wall and let the entrepreneur come and snuffle it up and whatever. But I think that there has to be an effective handover between the two, which we haven't got the full answer to, but I think we can see what that looks like. In terms of where we are, you say 6%. I mean, 6% I think was 2016, so we're already beyond 6% wind and solar. Paolo's shaking. You've lost bets with me before on this stuff, so be careful. If you include distributed, non-grid connected, rooftop, and so on, but it doesn't matter. 7%, something like that, 8%. But I do think that there is a bit of a difference between what BNEF has said historically and the IEA, and one of the causes of difference is just small differences in experience curve assumptions that make very big difference. And I talked about these breakpoints becoming grid competitive and then becoming beyond grid competitive, actually starting to be, shut down existing coal and gas. And I guess, BNEF doesn't do scenarios. They do one central scenario. And what's going to happen as countries get into that second sort of break point, there could be, all hell could break loose, because what's going to happen is some very powerful companies with a lot of assets at play are going to find that their coal and gas plants are just shut down for, they're being shut down by new build. Now, the response of the politicians could be, well, we just won't allow that new build because our mates who've got these assets will be bankrupted. And it's very easy to stop a new build. You just don't give there are always various licenses and permissions and so on. So I guess we're optimistic that about the fundamental economics, that where we're more aggressive, that I think we, BNEF, my BNEF former colleagues that I trained, are more aggressive about cost reductions than IEA has been, and also optimistic about those economic, that economic sort of progress being reflected. And I think that's not just about wind and solar, but it's also about what are the enabling technologies, because whether it's demand response, whether it's batteries, and those batteries could be in electric vehicles, grid connected, those are also technologies that have their own cost dynamics. And so you can either be bullish about the cost reductions or not bullish, or slight differences over 20 years make a big difference. So we, in the NEO scenarios, it is, you know, I minimized, I said, well, IEA, I think the central scenario is 20% wind and solar, and BNEF it's 38%. Well, that's double. So BNEF's scenarios are for double the amount of wind and solar that IEA in the central new policy scenario is predicting. So let me just come back to your other point, which is about which is already a sort of normative. Well, there was two things about how much it has to be 80% decarbonized. I only spoke so far about wind and solar. Of course, there's a lot of hydro, nuclear. There's a big, you know, one of these other sort of overly polarized debates. You know, it becomes, should we build nuclear or renewables? And I spent half my time on Twitter trying to sort of put a stake through the heart of those two extremes. And the answer is, you know, we are going to have very, very cheap renewables, but it can't do the whole job. And nuclear, if it can fulfill certain criteria, will be a tremendous complement and a great weapon to have. But that doesn't mean we do only nuclear and should stop building renewables with all of the learning and all of the progress that implies. And also, there's an incredible misunderstanding out there in the sort of general commentariat, not the folk in this room, but that nuclear is very, you know, existing nuclear, much of which is fully depreciated, these old plants built in the 80s, very cheap. And by the way, running it, you know, as long as it's as long as the governance is good and the engineering is good, the fact that you're producing, you know, nuclear waste doesn't increase risk because you've already got a waste problem and a waste, you know, you've already got your whole nuclear materials issues to manage. So existing nuclear can be very, very cheap, but new nuclear in anything other than command economies has proven itself, the current generation, very, very expensive. But that means that you can think differently about maintaining nuclear than building new nuclear. And in fact, not that you can think differently, you have to think differently. So I think hydro, I think existing nuclear, hopefully some new nuclear. I don't have a lot of hope for CCS, but I do have a lot of hope for synthetic fuels, taking the carbon out of power station exhaust and, you know, chemically with catalysts or whatever approach, turning it into a fuel for at least a second pass through the system. I'm very hopeful of that. But then finally, I guess, I mean, part of your statement is normative. You know, we need this, which is, you know, yes, we do need 80%. I probably don't think we're going to get to 80%. You know, all of the above, assuming we can. I tell you, we can't. I don't think we can get to 80% if we're shutting down nuclear power stations. Right? If you said we're going to keep every nuclear power station we've got and extend its life, I think we've got a much better chance of achieving it. And you know, that's sort of slightly a message to the Germanys and the others of the world, I think, are being incredibly irresponsible from a climate perspective by indulging the nuclear shutdown desire before the climate need.
Okay. Thank you very much. First, I think we have German diplomacy. If they want to make a comment, please, more than welcome. And second, what I think Laura mentioned is that we need, not as the IEA, but as the planet, if we want to have a sustainable energy future. Yes, Laszlo.
First of all, Michael, great to see you here, and I apologize for being late. I was really tempted to cancel the FT Smart Energy Summit to be here in time with you, but otherwise they would have given that keynote slot to BNEF, and I can't let that happen. What I would like to ask you is what was striking for me in that FT event and also in the BNEF summits and also in the entire smart energy innovation community is the narrative that the energy transition is going to be like Facebook replacing MySpace spontaneously on the basis of technological superiority, driven by pure economics. We have this exponential growth of renewables. We don't take any policy assumptions. This is just happening on the basis of pure economics. And there's an interesting cultural gap that in Silicon Valley, disruption is celebrated as a positive thing, whereas us, the energy security community, we are working very hard to avoid disruption. Because if the electricity system is disrupted, then the army has to be deployed to maintain order. So I wonder that when I look at, for example, that 38% that you described, do you feel that the electricity system can handle it as it is and the lights stay on and we are stupid to worry about it? Or the second scenario, do you feel that everything along the journey will be resolved by smart innovators attracting venture capital and working along the lines, and governments can essentially go to hibernation? Or the third question, because this is also a group of policy professionals, that do we actually have a job to do? So if it is the third, I would be very much interested in so what are your recommendations, is what the policy and regulatory committee needs to do, especially incorporating there are some really hard institutional rigidities, like the United States is still using the Federal Power Act of 1935. So what, do we have a job to do, and if yes, what?
Okay, so yeah, absolutely we have a job, we all have a job to do, because the sort of the California disruption model, I mean, it's great if you're a disruptor, but it doesn't provide electricity continuity. It doesn't provide power to poor people. It produces products that that people in California use, like Tesla sports cars, but it doesn't solve the needs of an Indian commuter in their first job trying to get to work and so on. So we've got to be, absolutely that sort of pure disruption model doesn't work. But the overcautious, policy-driven model, and I can give examples from other industries, I call it the Minitel model, where a government decides this would be a good thing and it's the solution, and then plows billions and tens and hundreds of billions, hundreds of millions into solutions without building in human behavior and understanding how innovators will come and disrupt their chosen innovation. I don't think that system works either. And so I think it's an interplay. It is an interplay, and it won't be perfect. By the way, there will be plenty of examples of stupidity. And Solyndra, I think, was an absolutely stupid business to support in the first place, and it was not a surprise to me that it failed. And so there'll be lots of those. But at the end of the day, I think that the role of the policymaker, in a way, is to minimize the stupidity and to maximize the space for the innovators. There are lots, if it's primarily around, if the role of the policymaker, there's some stuff around basic research, which doesn't happen in the private world because the time distance between research and implementation and rollout is too long, or because it's capital intensive, or because there are coordination problems. So you've got a public role around research. You've got then mainly there's a role definitely around sort of removal of barriers. An example, in the UK, if you generate electricity and stick it in a battery, you have to pay tax because you've generated electricity. But if you then serve that electricity out of a battery to a user, you pay tax again. Right? It's just a stupid double taxation, and those sorts of things can be, identified and removed as barriers. The problem with in our space, never mind Minitel, but one of the problems around overly top-down control of this, I think there's a real issue around capacity markets. You say, well, we like the innovation, we like people to go off and build all this stuff, but somebody has to pay for for security. And when that decision about how much capacity margin is kept in the system, when that decision is made by a minister or a civil servant or a centralized grid operator, they will be overly conservative. And it will remove the signals that the innovative community need in order to move fast. So capacity markets reward incumbents, they reward incumbent plants. They can even be written to, there was a whole 5-year period, I believe, where in one of the US markets where they were written as your generator has to be X and Y ready. So if you were a battery, you simply couldn't participate because the way that the law was written, and it took a long time to get that changed. But also the risk aversion, even if it's even if that's all solved, the risk aversion means that you will over provision to make sure there are no blackouts. And what you really want, so I've written, I wrote about a year ago a piece on how you try to get that price signal into the system, so that if the problem of the capacity is that it's a peak of demand during the halftime of the World Cup final, or the Galatasaray playing in the European Champions League, Exactly. But at that half time, if everybody goes and puts the kettle on, goes to the loo, which drives the water pumps, and opens the fridge for the milk or for a beer, then if that's your problem, then you probably need maybe a flywheel or a battery and not an old coal power plant to be kept on the system. But the capacity market will tend to do the coal plant and not the innovative solution. So, I mean, these are all sort of detailed examples, but I think it's that interplay of policy and innovation. And let me give you another, because I'm in, sort of an important place for this stuff. I look at the EU, and the US. We have this huge problem of the government at this point, taking its foot off the accelerator, stepping out of Paris climate in terms of clean energy and climate, coming out of the Paris Agreement or planning to, and so on. And yet, it's this monstrously innovative economy. And it is sucking carbon out of its system because, just because economics, because innovation, because whether it's cheap, cheap gas from fracking, or whether it's cheap renewables or cheap approaches to energy efficiency, that's what's happening. And then in the EU, which is really committed to this agenda, because it's not such an innovative economy, we're sort of protecting jobs in the diesel supply chain and protecting jobs in existing incumbents which use a lot of coal, and protecting, and by going slow on innovation, we are also by definition going slow on climate. And so I think that it's that interplay between innovation and policy that we need to get right. It's neither one nor the other. It's going to be both working together.
Thank you very much, Michael. Again, we have several European ambassadors here. Either now or after the meeting, you may want to have a closer discussion.
I hope you won't get into trouble for having invited me with these radical views.
We are completely free here.
Views.
No, it is. We want to be as frank as possible. Now, there are several questions. I will go to I see Timur is asking a question here, but I have one question in the meantime to benefit from your presence here. You mentioned clean energy transitions, which is, of course, a key topic for the IEA as well. But you mentioned the UK, Sweden, Europe. But we, as IEA, we are putting all of our efforts and resources and everything on China, India, Indonesia, ASEAN countries. And I think almost every week, one of my colleagues in China and India, I was in India last week. So are we doing something right? Where shall we put of course, we work with our member countries very closely as well. But if you were to give us advice, Michael, who is a person who pushes the clean energy transition so strongly, where shall we put the emphasis on in terms of the getting the benefits, more benefits, and again, low-hanging fruits story?
Well, so the big numbers are, China, India, Indonesia, even, Malaysia, South Africa, Brazil, Egypt, because that's where the big numbers of people and also the big growth in demand are. But also equally, the developed world is where the current per capita energy use is, and also where the financial resources and the technology sits. And we have to, the miracle of China is changing that, but it hasn't changed it fully. And the innovation, a lot of it, as I say, is coming out of the US and out of Europe, although perhaps not with the same impact. Tesla and so on are in the US. So I think that you've got to do both. And what I would say is I would love to see more dialogue around the concept of energy leapfrogging, because I've watched the debate about. So I'm enormously committed to energy access. I've just been privately building a solar and battery system for a neonatal intensive care unit in Sierra Leone, and it's been, it's the least I can do. But I've worked with Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, launched Sustainable Energy for All, and I've done lots, and I'm really I couldn't be more committed to the energy access agenda. What's very interesting was that. It is accelerating, and a lot of the acceleration is to do with actually this interplay, top down, India connecting villages, bottom up, now nearly 150 million people getting electricity through new, novel, clean energy technologies. That interplay is sort of working. But there isn't really, and there hasn't been, a discussion about leapfrogging. You know, we saw India, you know, going into the climate negotiations very much with this kind of equity perspective. It's our right to industrialize and to become heavy energy users just like the developed world, and we will do it through, you know, coal and a bit of gas because we don't have much of that, and it'll be very, and of course also, you know, internal combustion, you know, cars and oil. And I would have loved that to have been a much more innovative, much more kind of mold-breaking discussion where, you know, India could have come to those negotiations and say, listen, we're going to develop economically. I'm totally committed to that. I have no issue with that. But if you can all help, we'll do it using cleaner technologies, whether they're renewables, super efficiency, nuclear, public transport, whatever it is. Help us to do that, and then we don't need to do the stuff that's going to, you know, cause all of the climate damage. And that narrative never really, it's still not powerful enough. I think that's something that you could help with.
Definitely. Thank you very much. Excellent advice. And before going to the Hungarian ambassador, I'm very happy that it's excellent that you push this energy access issue, Michael. Your voice is very much appreciated. As IEA, we have started in 2002, Laura, if I am not wrong, to energy poverty, bringing to the international energy agenda. And many people thought this was a development issue, not an energy issue. And since 2002, we have been working on it. And this year, we have been given by the United Nations as the custodian of this energy access issues and working with many international organizations. Your voice is very much appreciated. Mr. Ambassador.
So, thank you very much. I'm really terribly sorry, but I do not believe the ideas of Maria Mazzucato. You mentioned 2 times this mission-oriented innovation, interplay, you mentioned these policies. The facts simply not support this kind of idea. But when we look at this whole transformation, I think it is relatively simple to say that it is easier to achieve in the public sector from the technology. Because the technology rather supports artificial intelligence and so on, rather support centralized solutions. I do understand that the public sector is not really famous for innovation, but there are one player who are really famous for innovation, that is the entrepreneur, not the entrepreneurial state, entrepreneur. So my question in that case, and apart from that whole idea, mission-oriented innovation and so on, forget it at a moment. How do you see the chances to work together, the private sector in that case, the private innovators, and the public sectors to achieve this transformation in the public sector, let's say, in the public transport? Thank you.
So actually, there's a side point which might be very interesting to actually get Mariana Mazzucato, you know, to talk about, because, you know, the fact is that the great technologies that the innovators, you know, Elon Musk is using today came out of public sector research, and that's, you know, that's the stuff that Mariana Mazzucato, you know, writes about, how Apple uses all of these technology, fracking in the U.S., whether it's the horizontal drilling or whether it's the use of the supercomputers to simulate fields. And so on. You know, this came out of DOE research originally. So, and that's a great example of the answer to your question. So, I mean, you know, I differ. I say I differ from her very much in terms of whether the public should continue to own those innovations, because I believe that would actually suppress the point at which you need the innovators to come in. If you still had state ownership of those technologies, I think that would be disastrous. But I think that's already a clue to, you know, the answer to your question is there has to be a handoff. I think the state can set technology directions and does set technology directions, but then needs to get those advances out into the entrepreneurial community. And there's a lot of places where that falls over. I will say also, just in terms of that sort of entrepreneurial state, which you deride, there's a lot of things that the state can do which can create the conditions. So I don't know whether it's entrepreneurial, so frankly I don't care. What I look at is you could do procurement decisions. The state buys, you know, in most countries the state is responsible for 40% of the spending and doesn't at the moment use that weapon to say, okay, if you can perform like this, if you can produce a bus that does this, we will buy tens of thousands of them because we're actually in the bus buying business, either through local government or central government. I think procurement is a big potential lever, but also things like, you know, do we have, if you go through all of the different areas of government, local authority government, building codes, trade policy, the educational policy, one of the biggest problems we've got across country after country is our building quality, frankly, is shocking. And it's not enforced, building codes are not enforced, but also the skills are not there in the builder community. So you have an enormous opportunity for, if you like, the state to help create the right sorts of entrepreneurs. Builders, plumbers, electricians, they're entrepreneurs, right? They work for themselves, but they're not given the tools. If you wanted to find somebody who could really insulate, really produce an airtight house with good insulation in London, almost impossible to find the architects, the builders, the HVAC engineers, etc., etc. And it's a failure. Essentially, it is a failure that starts with government because they're the ones who regulate the education system, or is it a failure? I mean, it's a systemic failure, but it's certainly a point where the policymakers could get involved and could make some very substantial impacts. So I think it's about the role of the state is about this kind of internally consistent set of policies across central government and local government. And by the way, when you said the most innovative people are the entrepreneurs, I thought you were going to say the most innovative is actually the military. You know, and the military has real reasons to do some of this stuff. And again, in the US, despite the fact that the president doesn't think climate change happens, the military is actually concerned about both energy efficiency of its non-resilient fuel supply chains and also the impacts of instability around the world from droughts and floods and weather, whatever, which is where climate is clearly, they see it as a threat multiplier. I don't know if that answers the question, but I guess I'll just finish by saying, you know, it's not about, you know, if you sort of started in by saying, oh, you know, this is all rubbish and that sort of, and I think we need to get beyond that polarization. Say, look, do we want more of this stuff? Yes. How do we work together? You don't necessarily even need to believe in climate change to want our cities to be more resilient. So why aren't we working on resilient cities? Instead, we have these kind of very ritualistic discussions about climate change and this, that, and the other. I think they're not helpful.
Excellent. Now I go to Timo.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Liebreich, for the discussion. I think I'm a bit confused a little, to be quite honest with you, about on the one hand what you said about solar PV, etc., and the important role of government, and then, you know, the kind of this almost hands-off mentality to some extent, right, that you're postulating for the future. So there is a bit of, and I agree that that the idea of working together here is a good one, you know, between, after all, we're all after fostering innovation. But my question is really about what you're saying about transport and the role of electricity. I think we can all agree that there is a big potential in short-term travel for electricity, etc. I think it's no secret that when you think of taxis or fleets, etc., which do 300 kilometers a week, etc., there is a big element where this is cost competitive. But you also talked about all these other sectors that are indeed difficult to crack, right? About aviation, about trucks, and various others. Now you have portrayed a picture, certainly in your commentary that you put forward, about the amazing prospects that electrification might have here. But obviously for us as energy people, it will also be good to understand how relevant is this, right? How relevant is this for energy demand, right? Oil demand, how much of this is actually sitting there? That would be extremely helpful.
Okay, just on the confusion point, I guess I'm sorry, I find myself in one of my more sort of expansive and rambling days. I apologize. But all I'm talking about is regulated markets. we've had this huge boom in aviation. It's not unregulated, right? We regulate safety, we regulate takeoff and landing slots, and we regulate noise and all sorts of things. And I guess what I'm saying, to draw the analogy, is that the growth in aviation, the massive impact, whether it's through holidays or through fresh strawberries in the middle of winter, that impact that was unleashed when countries stopped trying to have state-owned airports and national airlines. And it's that kind of, so it doesn't mean that it's deregulated. So it is confusing because it is a regulated market. And the question is, how do you do the lightest touch regulation? That's what I don't have all the answers, but I do know that if we have light touch regulation that creates competition, that enables those entrepreneurs to go in and move really fast and deploy money. There's $200 trillion of money desperate for yields and investment. If we can create the opportunity to put that to work that's in the service of the agenda we're all interested in, then we'll see rapid progress. To the point about the sectors, I guess what I was trying to do with the piece I wrote and published last week about aviation and shipping and so on is don't think of it as aviation, really segment it. And there's some people get excited about urban air taxis, but I'm really, I think short haul and short haul is very different from long haul. Shipping, a ferry that crosses a fjord, or even a ferry that goes to an island off Croatia, and it just goes forwards and backwards at the moment, spewing this huge plume of black smoke and traveling 45 minutes, all going electric. Now, is it meaningful in terms of the electricity demand of the world? Well, it is in two ways. Number one, it will be a chunk of electricity, of oil demand that goes electric. Buses, right now, 400,000 electric buses in the world, 99% of them in China. That has reduced oil demand by about I think it's 0.25, 0.28 million barrels a day. So it's about 0.3 of the demand for oil we would otherwise have seen has been eliminated just by Chinese urban buses. Now, I think it's significant even at the margin, right? Sorry? No, but it doesn't matter. It's electric buses, right? And then you say, is it significant? Well, you know much better than me that removing, even 1 or 2% of oil demand can be very dramatic in terms of the price implications. But the other thing is the learning effect. We mustn't underestimate the fact that even if you just do a ferry across a Norwegian fjord, suddenly you've ended up with a team of engineers who now want to do, 2 more the next year, then 4, then 8, then 16, and so on. And so, it's not just that you can do the very short haul and that will remove a few percent of this and a few percent of that. It's that is the learning process. If we don't do that, if we just sit there going, I wish it was a bigger impact, we'll never get started. We have to get started and do those things. So I think I think transport is 14%, I believe, of CO2 emissions. And or something like, I'm doing this from memory.
Cars are 8% only.
Cars
8%.
Okay, so then that's probably that's cars and trucks. It's probably 14. So yes, it's going to be meaningful. And if you add in the ships and I mean trains are very interesting because they can all go clean much more easily than aviation, long distance aviation.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Michael. In fact, I don't want to make any comments, but just a small footnote here. When we talk with the Chinese ministers and the prime ministers, they are telling us that the reason they are pushing electric cars are mainly because of air pollution reasons rather than climate change. And our numbers in the World Energy Outlook and other publications show that even a major electrification of the cars will not have a big impact on the CO2 emissions because the cars are only 8% and we have to also decarbonize, as you say, the power generation system. Now, one final question, who would like to ask? I think I look at Peter here. Before Peter, anybody wants to ask a question? No, I go to Peter. Peter is our division head for gas, coal, and power. And Timur, who asked the question, is the new head of our energy technology division. Peter?
Well, thank you, and thanks for your very interesting comments. My question to you is actually to explore a little more this question of electricity pricing, and particularly, you started to talk about it, but what the impact is going to be of this cheap supply of electricity, and we have, say, a fairly expensive grid, and how you get it down to the customers, and how do you start making those kinds of changes. You identified a couple kinds of barriers, but I would think there are other kinds too, like taxation and other sources. How do we get cheap electricity in the hands of the entrepreneurs?
Thank you. And like I said, I wish I had the answers, but I actually don't think. I think this is an area where we don't. One thing's for sure is that right now we've got, we're in an era where we have cheap wind, cheap solar, cheap coal, cheap gas, particularly in the US, but because of the increasing LNG market, the liquidity of LNG delivery, that cheap gas will be slightly more expensive, but it'll be global, or from Australia or wherever else. We've got, everything's cheap except new nuclear, basically. So we've got very, very cheap supplies, but they can be at the wrong time of the day or of the week or month, and they can be in the wrong place. So from an engineering point of view, it's pretty clear what we need is transport, the ability to move it around, or either in time or in geography. And then from a market point of view, we need to figure out how everybody that's needed in that matrix gets paid. And that's actually the difficult bit, because it's quite easy to map out how you do those other things. I've talked in a piece that I wrote about a year ago about this thing called the firm spread, because I think in terms of the wholesale markets, what we need to see is where firm power commands a premium, which it doesn't currently. In the spot markets, it suddenly it commands a huge premium if there's a shortfall, and you see these great spikes, and that's fine. I think the spikes are a price signal, but what you can't do, there isn't the liquidity in the wholesale markets to say, well, I want to protect myself against that 5 years out or 10 years out. We don't have a forward price curve for the relative difference in value between sort of bulk, cheap electricity and flexible capacity out into the future. And that's what we really need, because these are all capital investments. So the fact that you see a big price spike today, when you go to the investment committee and say, I think we should build a flywheel or a battery or a gas plant or we should invest in building demand response capacity, we should retrofit our aluminium smelters with some technology that enables them to play in the... And if all you can point to is the spike this year and a belief that that's going to get worse in the future, that's a very difficult investment to make. So I don't know how we can achieve... I don't know that all of the pathways in all of the different political economies of the world, but we need to start seeing that sort of differential pricing between the bulk, cheap variable and the flexibility going forwards. And let me say also, I think we also see a big trend towards things like private wire and corporate PPAs, because companies are essentially taking it into their own hands to say, well, why am I buying electricity for 11, 12 cents per kilowatt hour when I've got whether it's a bunch of roofs and car parks, I can put solar, or I can buy wind and I can wheel it through the system, and we see that. So there's a lot of micro solutions, but I think we need to see the wholesale markets really start to develop product that enables that sort of risk management, and out in the 5-year, 10-year future, to start trading flexibility out into the future. So capacity markets right now, they tend to go on this sort of 1 year, 2 year, 3 year cycle. That's not enough. That's the wrong participant playing in the market, and it's much too near term.
Michael, we are far. I think Rebecca is looking at me 5 minutes beyond our schedule, but I have a couple of very small. I want to give one keyword, if you can elaborate very briefly, a couple of things. One of them is offshore wind. My deputy Paul Simons is going on Friday to Halifax to talk about our offshore wind work. what is your view, very briefly, about offshore wind prospects with or without connection with hydrogen?
So offshore wind, I mentioned, was one of the things really surprised us, the speed with which the costs came down. And offshore wind is one of those things, it's very different than, for instance, geothermal, in that if you can do it in a lot of places. There's an enormous amount of it. If we can do floating offshore, and my gut tells me that might even be cheaper than fixed offshore. If that's true, then we're in a whole different energy world, because once you're floating, you can do it anywhere. And if you're coupling it with hydrogen, I think you'd have to couple it with hydrogen. And I'm not convinced I'm very unconvinced about this model that says we'll do hydrogen from surplus renewables, because hydrogen electrolysis, compression, etc., is going to be capital intensive. So the idea of building some capital intensive stuff and then only running it when there's a puff of wind or unneeded excess solar in the middle of summer, that feels very unrealistic. I think we will do hydrogen from things like solar plus an overnight battery in Saudi Arabia, because that would be essentially running 24/7. Offshore wind could do it. The capacity factor is 55, 60%. Is that high enough to compete with that kind of Saudi hydrogen model, or Mexican, or wherever, or Nevada, or parts of India and so on? I don't know. But I think that's one of the kind of wild cards is offshore wind. I think we'll see a lot more of it than any of us think, particularly if floating can be done cheaply. But we just don't know how that hydrogen thing is going to play out.
I think we have high expectations from offshore wind, Laura, in our World Energy Outlook coming here. Another keyword for you, Michael. You mentioned bypassing that you are not very optimistic about the CCUS. Can you just elaborate a bit? What are you think it is an important technology? Why there is no appetite? Can you just elaborate on that as well?
So you said CCUS, and the U piece of it I am optimistic about. Synthetic fuels, where you take the CO2 out of an exhaust stream and you find a way of revalorizing that and using it, I think is going to be. I mean, it feels to me, we had this next generation biofuels hype cycle. People got excited, and then it didn't generate scalable businesses. But the idea that over the next 10, 20 years, we won't find a way using abundant sunshine, abundant CO2, abundant air, to find business models that use that CO2, I think that would be a dangerous bet, to bet that we can't do it. I think pure CCS, and not enhanced oil recovery, but pure CCS, it's very hard because, first of all, it's very capital intensive, and secondly, there's a parasitic load on the output of the power stations. Capturing the CO2 requires work, and so it just requires endless subsidy, and it produces nothing but carbon mitigation. And that subsidy has to be given to who? The owner of a power station, or the owner of a pipeline, or the owner of an oil company. And politically, I find that very hard to see how, and the numbers are trillion scale, as you know. And if you just look at the amount of CO2 that's coming out of coal and gas, just the volumes, it's comparable to the amount of, clearly the gas is comparable to the amount of gas that is produced by the oil and gas industry, and coal is comparable to the amount of oil. So I find it hard to see how politically that gets done. There's no electricity that's produced. In fact, the opposite. It clearly drives up the electricity prices, and the money is given to people that are not politically popular.
Yeah. Thank you. Again, putting our expectation here, we have high expectations CCUS to take off, and American 45Q tax credits and others. And your friend, Mrs. Perry's, the Claire Perry's push, and among other countries, is important. My last question, I have to finish it here. You mentioned the renewables. Thank you very much. The electrification, the industry sector, and also you mentioned oil, gas, and coal, because we have only one energy world. It's not only renewables. They are all interacting with each other this or that way. So when you look at the future, of course, you look at the entire picture. In the next 5 years, I am sure the ambassadors and my colleagues would like to know, how do you see the oil and gas price developments in the next 4 or 5 years? How would they move, you think, and what are the drivers of that?
Let me say just before I do, on CCS and CCUS, I would love to be proven wrong. I'd love to be proven to be too pessimistic. I also, if I might, just come back to one other thing, which is about the energy access. You know, one of the things that I think is interesting about your work and my work is we do quite a bit of myth busting. And I think one of them on energy access that's out there that needs to be addressed is this idea that you have to do coal to solve the energy access problem. And I worry about that. Every time we've looked, we found that it's not the case. And you talked about the air quality. You know, there's no point solving an energy access problem marginally cheaper maybe, but then ending up 5, 10, 15 years with a huge public health problem. So I just wanted to, if I might, to just complete on that. In terms of oil and gas, the gas I think I've already talked about.
Price developments, how do you see the price development?
Well, so we've now, there seems to be, I don't want to say an infinite amount, but a lot of gas available, non-conventional gas in the US, cheap gas out of Qatar, out of Australia, and so on. And you know, LNG is picking up speed, and so you know, we saw a period of these very substantial spreads. You know, $3 gas, $2 gas in the US per million BTU, and 15 or 17 or 18 in Asia. I don't think we're going to see that again just because of LNG. So I think we're going to have cheap gas in the US, and it's going to be, you know, we're going to see some, you know, we're going to see this compressed spreads. I don't know. I mean, we don't model exactly. So, you know, 7, 8, 9, but probably less than that around the world. In terms of oil, that's another where there's this sort of fake discussion of very extreme positions. On the one hand, people saying, you know, look, you know, the Tesla 3 has been launched, so the oil price will be $20, and others saying, no, it's becoming harder and harder to find. All this stuff is irrelevant. It's becoming harder to find oil. We have to go to the Arctic, to the deep this, to the, and it's going to be $150 before you know what, or $200, I think was the latest, most recent number pulled out of the ether. And the answer is, the answer lies in the interplay of not just electrification, but also energy efficiency, also efficiency, CAFE standards, and those things are, that's a US term, but efficiency of internal combustion. And so there's very clearly a peak and then a fall in oil demand for transportation. And I'm being careful because that doesn't cover plastics, which will ultimately go to bioplastics, but that will take, you know, numbers more decades. But the question is, if you look at that sort of demand destruction, will it be fast enough to strand existing producing assets? The answer is no. Because, you know, again, here, more than anywhere else in the world, you know how the existing fields decline. And they decline fast. So the idea that demand destruction from any of this is going to be faster than the decline of the fields is a fiction. So definitely we're going to be investing to extend the lives of fields and to develop fields. So that means that sort of the $20, $10 scenario is nonsense. Then we're investing to extend the lives of fields, which means that we must be in the sort of $30, $50, $60 range. But then the question is, are we going to have to really look for new? Are we going to have to go to Arctic and deep sea and subsalt and all of the kind of really difficult stuff that would require prices of 100, 110, 120, 140? And my view is probably not. So I think we're in that kind of, you know, let me call it $60 plus or minus 20, with spikes either way because of, you know, geopolitics and crises, with which, again, you're far more familiar than me. But, you know, if you're doing strategic planning, I would even say, you know, 50 plus or minus 20, and anything else, if your business plan requires anything outside that, you're probably taking a completely unreasonable risk.
So 50 plus minus 20, so between 30 and 70. I think Neil is now want to know what is the exact price, because it's a big, for the oil markets,
Yes.
a very big interval. So for $1, he has a heart attack every day if it goes up and down. So you put about, I thank you very much.
Oh, that's strategic. I can't do short term.
No,
I can only do strategic.
Thank you very much. Strategic views always much appreciated. But Michael, your presence here is very much appreciated, especially as all the colleagues know here. We have a very strong clean energy transitions program working with many countries, putting the clean energy technologies at the top of the agenda. All the technologies, renewables, energy efficiency, CCUS, nuclear power, electric vehicles, and all of them, all of the technologies. And your presence here, your advice, your thoughts are very much appreciated. It is great to have such a wonderful expert, a brilliant entrepreneur, and a well-established consultant with us here. I would like you to join me to thank Michael Liebreich. Thank you very much, Michael.